fourth objective of this session is to examine perceptual biases or perceptual errors in the performance management process. So we're going to take a look at 6 common perceptual errors that raters can make in performance management process. First, we have the halo effect, which you may be familiar with from a previous course. Halo effect, of course, refers to a rater allowing a single trait, outcome, or consideration influence other measures of performance. So, for example, we might assume that an employee who is honest is also hardworking, is also an excellent leader, and so on. What we're doing here is essentially allowing one behavior to color our impressions of other behaviors in a positive light. The opposite of that would be known as the horns effect. And that is another bias that can come into play where for instance, in evaluating employees' performance, we may see one aspect of performance in which the employee is lacking when reviewing performance. For instance, the employee might be a poor leader, and then use that to rate the employee lower in other aspects of their performance. For instance, the employee might then rate the employee lower in their actual work performance, in their team performance, in any other areas that relate to the organization's vision, and so on. Second perceptual error is known as stereotyping. Stereotyping, the rater makes performance judgments based on employees' personal characteristics rather than the employee's actual performance. And this is a bias usually based upon things like gender, age, racial stereotypes, and so on. Age stereotypes typically go along the lines of older employees are more senior, have more experience, and are therefore more knowledgeable than younger employees, and allowing that to color our ratings of the employee's performance. Sometimes we use racial stereotypes. Some common racial stereotypes that I've read about already includes, things like Asian Americans are wizards at using computers, and this of course can lead to higher ratings when it comes to computer use, and of course lower ratings when it comes to other aspects of the work. So it can be problematic when these biases come into play. Other, of course, gender stereotypes is of course another popular bias that can affect performance ratings. Okay, so the key takeaway here is to assume that not everyone in the same group possess identical traits. Okay. The third bias or error is known as the primacy or recency. There are separate type of errors that can be made. Primacy error means relying on early cues or early events or behaviors and letting these bias the rater's evaluation of the employee's overall performance. So relying on the earliest impressions, the saying first impressions last. So relying on those early impressions, perhaps early in the performance cycle, let's say in the first month or so, and allowing that early behavior, perhaps whatever it was relating to performance, let that shape the rater's impressions of that individual employee's performance throughout the year. So that of course is a bias because the employee may perform poorly in 1 month or perhaps one instance and then perform superb during the other months. The opposite is true of the recency error, whereby, and this is definitely a bias that can happen, whereby the rater experiences or views the employee committing perhaps performing poorly right before a performance review. So let's say we have an employee who has performed superbly for 11 months out of the 12-year cycle, and in the 12th month, the employee may have had some obstacle or something at home or something that has led to lower performance during that 1 month. Right before the performance review, that's what we call recency error, and allowing that recent subpar performance shape the impression of the rater for the actual individual employee for the entire year. So that is of course the next bias that can take place. We have 2 more biases called distributional errors and contrast error. Distributional errors, we talk about things referring to leniency, harshness, central tendency, and so on. If you look at the diagram here, what you will see is that actual performance of the employee, or the number of employees and their performance, were generally good. We see that the blue line indicates that their performance was about normal. If we were to, of course, rate our employees along the other areas, along the other curves, we would be committing certain biases here. For instance, being harshness error, where we rate almost every employee at a very low level of performance, very poor performance. Most employees performing very poorly we see at that harshness level, rather than, or as compared to the blue curve, which is the actual or true performance. Central tendency typically means that the raters tend to choose the middle of the rating scale most often, and thereby almost every employee performs at an average level, with few or none performing at a poor or good level. That's when we commit the central tendency error. And finally, the leniency error is the dotted pink curve, or purple, which indicates that the majority of employees performed good. So in this case, we're rating too lenient, and everyone is performing excellent, with very few performing at an average level and no one performing at a poor level. So these are errors whereby raters tend to choose certain parts of a scale, particularly when we use scales to measure performance, which we will talk about after. This can be an issue. The final error is the contrast error, where a rater compares an individual not against an objective standard, but against other employees. And by doing so, sometimes inaccurately rates the employee. So let's take a look at the first example here on the left, and I'll ask you to just think about the second one on your own. So the first example on the left, this is an extract from Johnson Sachs 2007. Suppose an individual manager, we're using the most popular source of information here, right? So let's suppose a manager evaluates 3 employees in a row, and all 3 employees performed excellent. Okay, we see that here on the left side of the diagram. All 1, 2, 3 performed at an excellent level. Good. The 4th employee actually performed at an average level. So we see he is about midway as compared to 1, 2, and 3. However, the manager, if committing the contrast error, might perceive the 4th employee as performing at a poor level rather than an average level. Why would that happen? Well, that is where the contrast comes in. So the manager essentially contrasts the 4th employee with the first 3, and because the first 3 performed at such an excellent level, the 4th employee is perceived as performing much lower than he actually performed. So in other words, those first 3 employees shaped the rater's impression of that 4th person coming in, when that 4th person coming in should be evaluated on their own. Okay, so take a look at the right side of the diagram, and the opposite happens, and I'll ask you to take a look at that one on your own for me. Alright. So these are 5 perceptual errors that raters can make. And what we're going to do is I'm going to pose a case incident exercise on perceptual errors. Just so you can get an idea and familiarize yourself with some of the errors you make, I'll pose a very real case that can help to bring out the perceptual errors, and by studying these perceptual errors help you to identify ways to avoid them. So by actually training individuals to learn about these perceptual errors, we in turn learn to avoid committing them when performing ratings of employees. So that takes us to our 5th objective, which will be looking at measures of performance evaluation.